Dlamini.
Thank you, Andrew, for that lovely introduction here. And it's good to be here so early on a Friday morning, actually. I'm going to share my screen. I think you have it up? Okay, all right, great. And do forgive me if the PowerPoint does not necessarily correspond very well with what I'm going to say. I was writing the PowerPoint back and forth as I was also doing the paper. So I'm going to use more the PowerPoint. Sorry, I'm going to use more my own script than I will use the PowerPoint. But I have the PowerPoint just for you to look at and follow the conversation. And we are doing it, I'm going to do the conversation in a different style. I have here Dr. Beckford, Clinton Beckford, sitting right opposite me. I don't know if they can see you on the screen. And it's more going to be a conversation than it's going to be a lecture. So I'll be taking some questions from him as we go along, and I will also try to give a talk in some sort. This is just to break the monotony associated with Zoom. When you're on Zoom, you're on screen. And I took a course some time ago on distance learning, and we were warned never to do anything that's longer than 10 minutes with our students because they fall asleep. So in this particular way, I'm hoping that the conversational style is going to help break that kind of challenge that is associated with the screen Zoom. Okay. To start my conversation, I'm going to present what I call two race-informing vignettes. And I'm hoping that we're going to actually reflect on these vignettes together as I go on talking about race, anti-Black racism, and reflecting on the past 2 years and talking about how we can move forward. So here are the two vignettes, and then I'm going to do the introduction in terms of why are we here, okay? In 2012, at the CSSC conference, the Congress of Social Sciences in Education, I attended a panel called Does Gender Still Matter? Among the 4 panelists was Annette Henry, who is a Black scholar now at the University of British Columbia. She had entitled her talk, Troubling Tired Binaries, Why Gender Still Matters. At the end of the panel, there was a rush to the next conference sessions. However, a few people lingered behind to mingle and chat, and I was among those. At this time, I saw Annette coming up the auditorium stairs, acknowledging and talking to different people. And as she eventually reached where I was, we stood and we chatted. As we spoke, Annette kept looking towards the back of the auditorium, and she eventually asked that I wait for her as she went to talk with another Black woman who was standing at the back of the auditorium, looking around, holding her conference bag and thinking. Annette spoke with her for a while, and I waited. Eventually, they started to walk towards me, and on arrival, Annette introduced us. A few minutes later, the other woman, whose name I forget, I'm sorry about that, excused herself and left. And when she left, I asked Annette how she knew this woman. She said, I don't know her. I noticed her there on her own, and I wanted her to know that I see her and welcome her to the space in which I had been asked to speak. I'm fast forwarding now to 2017. In 2017, the York University's Faculty of Education organized a series of talks in recognition of Canada's 150 years. The third and final talk in the series was entitled Thinking Together, Identity Studies in the University. And I want you to note the notion of identity studies at the university. As was highlighted in the York University Daily News, the event aimed at, and I quote, bring together faculty and students for a thought-provoking day of conversation about the status of identity in the university. There were 3 guest speakers: Robin Wigman from Duke University, Manina Gonik from Mount St. Vincent University, and Roderick Ferguson from the University of Manitoba. I was invited by the organizers to offer a response to and to invite audience comments to Manina Gonik's talk and film work. I felt honored and I felt included. In the end, I thought I had performed my responsibility in a meaningful scholarly fashion, if I may say so. At lunch, I noticed Roderick Ferguson, panelist Black man from Minnesota, eating lunch on his own at the table where he had stood to present his talk. I joined him. Later that afternoon, during a health break, just before the start of the last presenter, Robin Wigman from Duke University, I noticed a colleague who had been away from for the season and went to greet and congratulate her. I congratulated her on her appointment as a visiting lecturer in residence at the University of Alberta, where she had been presenting university-wide lectures under the themes of psychoanalysis and education. And this theme was part of the university's distinguished visitor lecture series. As she spoke to me, I saw her starting to look sideways, to fade away. And I followed her gaze. Someone was approaching us, and on arrival, extended her hand to my colleague, greeted and introduced herself as Robin Wigman, while also expressing how happy she was to finally meet my colleague in person. My colleague responded, and they continued to talk with each other. I stopped to exist. And after a little while of lingering around, wondering if I were to be seen or included, I eventually drifted away without being seen or noticed. I had become invisible to both of them. Those are my 2 starting venues. Now, I want us to actually think about the notion of what it means to see someone and what it means to recognize someone. I want us to think about the notion of what it means to actually acknowledge someone. Some of my friends and colleagues are familiar with the first narration because I have narrated it over and over as an encounter that taught me 2 things. For Black women and other women of color in the academy, to be included requires an act of political awareness and experiences of exclusion. It requires knowledge of space and how it functions. I learned also that exclusion and racism occupy the same side of the academic coin. They are not opposites. Exclusion feeds on or is nourished by racism. I don't know which one is the egg and which one is the chicken, but there is something that's going on there. The second narrative, however, is a little complex. In fact, today is the first time I'm speaking about it. After the encounter, I went back home and I wrote in my diary, I reflected on it, and I invite you to actually reflect on it with me because it also did teach me 2 things, but it continues to teach me to date. One of the things I learned was to see others, you need to have seen and recognized a conscious act of inclusion and exclusion. And the second thing is racism and exclusion occupy the same side of the academic coin. They are not opposites. So why is this talk important today? I think you have to move down to the second slide. Forgive me, I'm just kind of.
Why is the reflection important?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Discussions around racism and anti-Black racism today have been going on for a long time. As my colleague Warren Critchlow at York University reminds us, these conversations are not beginning now. These conversations have existed before and they continue to exist. But we are now at a point where we have to begin again. It calls it beginning again. And to begin again is really not a continuation. We start where the conversations have stopped to actually become important. The other reason it's important to talk about issues of racism because of what's been going on over the past 2 years during the pandemic, how the pandemic has actually affected different groups of people in quite different ways. And these have been the way that the people have been different has been about influenced by race, issues of class, sexuality, and so on. We also, these conversations that we're having today are important because, as we know, the tragic death of George Floyd, which culminated into a global demand for greater social justice and has forced us to look at history and the marginalization of different parts of the population. This murder of George Floyd really led to the resurgence in the topic of anti-Black racism and related concepts. We also, and I don't know if it's on the next slide, we also have to have these conversations because of Canada's history. We know that, and the recent discovery of children in residential, dead bodies in residential schools. So it is important to actually to reflect on what we mean by moving forward after the conversation, after the pandemic. In continuing from my two vignettes, I want to invite you to reflect on space. And most of what I'm going to talk about here in my reflection of space is coming from an edited book that is coming out in April 2020. It is edited by myself and Angela Stienen at the Bern University in Switzerland. The book is entitled Specialized Injustice in the Contemporary City, Protesting as Public Pedagogy, and it's published by Routledge. So any theoretical or most of the theory that I'm going to be talking about here is really drawn from that manuscript. At some point in life, we ask ourselves a question of location. Where am I and how did I get here? Well, COVID-19 forced us into the same answer. I'm at home in front of the computer working. Now, this might sound silly, but this is the answer that many of us would have given when asked about our location: home, computer, work. In reality, as professors, we work for the university, or as others say, we are in the academy. But this space called the university is more than just a location where teaching and learning takes place. In other words, the university as space is not a neutral container in which university life takes place. It plays an active role in determining students' ability to learn and thrive in the world, for instance. So I invite you to reflect with me how the notion of justice and injustice works in university context. And in order to do this reflection, we must see space beyond its physical form. The late urban theorist Edward Sorger described space as an active force shaping human life. To understand the university, I use the idea of territories, multiple territories, which are produced in shifting terrain of social struggles. And I'm borrowing this from Porto Convales, 2001. In these struggles, people of different social positions, interests, and forms of capital dispute meaning, collective memories, and terms of the university. They produce or contest the way in which social injustice along concepts such as class, gender, ethnicity, race, or age is territorialized in the university, territorialized in the university. Contesting injustice through territorial practices become a means for marginalized populations or of re-signifying the university and of building social power, even if in the absence of economic power. It is through territorial practices that possibilities of a different future emerge. And here I'm actually citing my co-editor and colleagues, DNN 2020, and Brenner and Eden 2009. This perspective on space conceives the university not as an integrated unit, but as a contested site also for the formation of social identities.
Dr. Dlamini, if I might, first of all, I think Dr. Dlamini said the book she referenced would be coming out in April 2020, which is in the past. I'm sure she meant 2022.
2022, yes.
So I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, thank you.
But so you talk about the university as a physical space. Yeah, that's interesting to me because as a geographer, spatial analysis is the foundation of what we do. So you talk about space, about the university as a physical space, and this really interesting concept of the shifting terrain of social struggles, you know, a contested site for the formation of social identities. And, you know, I wondered, how did you come to be part of this space that's called the university? And, you know, what's your background and experiences that inform your framing of the university?
Oh, thank you for that question, Dr. Beckford. And thank you for the correction about my slip of the tongue. Yes, the book is coming out in April 2022. Thank you for that observation. And to answer your question about how did I come into thinking about the university in those terms, I want to invite all of us listening here to think about our own personal trajectories in becoming learners or scholars in the university. So just to start a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about my undergraduate mainly and not necessarily my graduate studies. My undergraduate degree was at the University of Swaziland, and I majored in English and anthropology, or was it anthropology as a minor, English and history. You just did something that Dr. Smith, which took away my presentation, my talk.
Okay.
Yes, you did. Although I don't understand how it took away from my screen. Okay, I got it. Yes, thank you. All right, I'll see somebody at the door also. Oh, all right. So my undergraduate degree was at the University of Swaziland. I majored in English and anthropology and minored in history and linguistics. But during those days, you actually didn't choose, Dr. Beckford. You said, I am going to do political science, and all the courses were given to you, and you just had to take what you were given. Now, I'm lucky to have gone through the university at a time when most African countries had just become independent, and African intellectuals were looking at ways to write back to the colonialist, so to speak. These were the times of vibrant anti-colonial sentiments, heightened notions of Black consciousness, and a nostalgia to return, or even a desire to return to pre-colonial Africa and its values. In English, for example, I studied African literature and I was introduced to scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Maria Maba, Wole Soyinka, and the likes. Interestingly though, in my English studies, none of the literature that I read at that time came from South Africa. And I do not know if this was by choice. South Africa was still going through apartheid. I was under apartheid at this time. What I remember though is that all the literature that was coming out of South Africa was in my mother language. And I also remember that I read this literature independently. In other words, I didn't have to do it for coursework. One of my biggest learning, however, was in anthropology at the what's called in Sangweni Bushman Caves. And to translate Sangweni is really dope, Bushman Caves. I don't know how it got that name. I remember very clearly the weeks we were left there by Professor Ngwabe Bebe of Zimbabwe to study and interpret the Bushman paintings on each wall. He would ask us, each person, to pick up, he would only pick us up when all the paintings had been correctly documented. Each person would be asked to choose a wall to work at, say why that particular wall was of interest, and then start the work. I later studied in Halifax that this method was called student-based learning or experiential learning, or both. Professor Bebe was also very articulate about his disappointment that at that time there was only one book written on the history of Swaziland. He motivated us to explore, ask people of their origins and development, observe the land, and document. Later, I realized that this was the beginning of my love for research, for exploring those things that I was curious about, to which there were no easily available answers. And I realized that this is when I learned to document. You have to remember that at that time, there was no Google or WhatsApp. So answers could only be found in books, and books I read. As a PhD student, I taught courses in anthropology at the anthropology department at U of T. I was amazed at the knowledge I had in this area, and I was even more surprised at the lack of information or misinformation about the African continent in general and about Southern Africa in particular. Students went to class to watch the infamous movie known as The Gods Must Be Crazy. Some of you must know this movie. It is a film that tells a story of the Bushmen of the Kalahari, politically correctly called now the Khoisan people. The man, who is the head of the household, sees a bottle of Coca-Cola falling from the sky. And because of his primitiveness, he takes it home to his family and to his clan, who all sit around the fire and try to explain what it is. They conclude that the bottle is an object that indicates the anger of the gods or the craziness of the gods. That's why the name of the movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy. Professor Richard Lee, who is known as a specialist in cultural anthropology of the Sub-Sahara, and with whom I worked, tried to explain to me how the field of anthropology itself was under siege at the time when I was a student. And in order to reimagine it, students needed to be captivated through film and made interested. And this film, The Gods Must Be Crazy, had been a bestseller, and thus its use at the university. I was not convinced. Now, I do not want to claim that all cultural anthropology courses at U of T or in the global north in general are about the exotic other, not at all. And I do not want to claim that all my, excuse me, I do not want to claim that all of my undergraduate or early education in the African continent was not without Western education. In fact, on the contrary, I remember in English, I studied all of what's known as the canon. I did all the canon, and I remember doing also the anatomy of criticism, which was written by Northrop Frye, who is a Canadian. Imagine then going through my PhD, learning that on our last class with Diane Bogdan, some of you might remember her, we were going to go see Northrop Frye. We were actually going to his house, and that he was alive. For me, actually, authors were dead, old white men. And here I am in class at the University of Toronto. I'm told that Northrop Frye was still alive. And Northrop Frye, I had read his book, The Anatomy of Criticism, when I was doing my undergrad at the University of Swaziland. So this to me was really a surprise. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven going to his house. So I'm not claiming that my undergraduate was anything superb, but what I'm trying to say though is that I feel very fortunate that in school, at that level, I was imbued with positive images, theories, observation of the self, the African continent, and its allies. And all of these images were positive. Now, young Black students growing up in Canada today cannot claim the same. I am happy that actually I am not, I went through school in a way that saved me from the bipolar of knowledge construction while becoming the self. The bipolar of becoming Black while producing and consuming knowledge that young people face in Canada today, I kind of like skipped. So that's what I'm claiming.
So, all right, that's interesting, right? And obviously, regardless of whatever shortcomings your education, your university education might have had, it obviously fulfilled a lot of your needs. Certainly, you know, in terms of your identity, your construction of your own identity, your value, your personhood. And you say that, you know, you were imbued with positive images, theories, observations of the self, the African continent and its allies. I think that's really, really important. And then you say young Black students don't benefit from that today. So I wanted to ask, how does the work of young Black people, I wanted to ask about the work of young Black people and how you see the university addressing their needs today or not. You talked about growing up and learning different things about yourself and what you did, for instance. Can you tell us how your work at the university today informs the lives of Black students?
I'm hoping that you're asking me this question because you're going to have me answer it, that one, because I wasn't anticipating it to be like that. But I would be very happy to actually have you help me answer it somehow. But just to start, you've done that again, Kara. Yeah, moved my notes. I'm not sure how you succeed to do that. Yeah.
Research project,
Yeah.
reflecting knowledge.
It's a research project, is what you're looking for on the screen. Yeah, okay. Now I have to go back to my notes on my computer, but it doesn't want to show them now. Okay, so I must close. No, I can't without leaving the meeting. Okay, I have to use this then because you've moved me away again. Yeah. I apologize for the little pause here. Okay, and to answer your question, Clinton, which I think we're going to answer together again, what do I do with young Black people and how does my work shape the way that young Black people proceed today in the world? Well, my work with young people has always been about understanding identity. And that is why, for me, the panel at York University and what it was trying to do was really very important. It was a talk or a coming together of intellectuals to talk about the role of identity in the university without necessarily looking at the identities of the people who were in the university. So my work with young people has always been about identity. It has also been about young people's way of doing or engaging politics. We are at a stage now where young people were at the forefront, for example, of the demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd. Angela Davis talking at the University of California in a series called The Fire This Time, mentioned an observation that I had, how young people were really at the forefront of all that was happening at that time. And they were very vocal, they were mobilizing, they were doing a lot of groundwork and actually engaged in demonstrations that wanted to say, we want the world to be a future that we're proud of, right? We want to engage in that. So in that series of The Fire This Time, Angela Davis called and spoke about the way that young people were engaged in these things as a rehearsal for a revolution. And I wondered about how the university is going to participate in this rehearsal, if it participates at all. So the work that I do with young people then is really trying to understand their way of engaging in political activities and events and how the university facilitates their political activism, political awareness, and so on. My work also with young people has been trying to bring together offline and online networking and how they use these different platforms for learning, but also for community mobilizing and for doing politics. Because the way the university operates, it's as though we go and we study engineering, we go and we study education, as though these subjects are very distant from the political everyday life of young people. So in my research, for example, and I've listed there on the slides, the different kinds of projects that I've worked with. But the main questions that I ask are, what are the forms and goals that young people have for the political future and for the socio-political environment, including school? By which means do they express themselves? So when we're talking about expression of young people, now there's popular media, but we really aren't in tune with all the forms of expressions that young people engage in. So I ask the questions, by which means do they express themselves, build communities, develop agency, and realize their political goals on and offline? I ask the questions, does material space and place still matter? Why and why not? Do gender, sexuality, class, and ethnicity, belonging matter as a mobilizing force? Why and why not? Nancy Fraser's notion of counter publics is important in my work to understand young people. Nancy Fraser stresses that counter publics are parallel discursive arenas where members of subordinate social groups invent and circulate counter discourses to formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and needs. These subaltern publics stand against the dominant discourses of the public, and they stress that counter-publics signals critical awareness that participants in the public sphere sometimes join with others and set themselves against wider publics and their discursive exclusions. Savage 2014 identifies three dominant publics: the political, the popular, and the concrete. He argues that we each belong to multiple publics and that our lives therefore immerse us in multiple and intersecting publics, which expose us to varied pedagogical forces. Savage also considers spatial bounded spaces of learning, such as the university and museums, as concrete publics. These publics include addresses who willingly choose to be, and addresses those who are willingly chose to be addressed. I'm sorry, there's something wrong there with my sentence. As these bounded spaces limit access, they create and shape a concrete public. Savage suggests that the main benefit of these concrete publics may be in their generation of space as productively pedagogical. So space is productively pedagogical, according to Savage. And he uses the notion Anahiki Modi 2014 uses the notion of liquid publics to refer to the involvement of youth in forming small-sized publics. Drawing on Habermas's theorization of the public sphere as a democratic space that fosters debate amongst its members for the purpose of the public good, Hikemodi nevertheless criticizes Habermas for his failure to address marginalized groups, a critique that is also stressed by Fraser, whom I mentioned before. She emphasizes the resistance of young people to being subsumed in the dominant group as they create their own dialogic space as liquid publics. The public action of protest following the murder of Floyd show the variegated ways of how people seek to disrupt hegemonic discourses and material structures and transform dominant and constraining cultural, political, economic, historical, linguistic, and ecological configurations. They expose how public pedagogues are either formed in spaces such as grassroots organizations, neighborhoods, initiative, art collectives, and so on, or how the collective action takes place beyond the pedagogue, even without any pedagogical intention at all, and how both ways provoke a rupture of what and who the involved actors and the territories of injustice have been before. I contend, therefore, that the university as a space of political learning and transformation need to take lessons from the events of the past year to configure sophisticated solutions to well-ingrained high-level academic terminology on racism and genocide. So that's really briefly a summary of what I do with young people and how I see them.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that perhaps in your next talk with us, you'll probably share a little bit about what you've learned through those interactions and research with youth. And then on that point that you ended about the need for the university as a space to take lessons from the events of the past year and a half or so. It's going to be interesting to see what we conclude where that is concerned. But I wanted to go back to the beginning, actually, of your talk, and those narratives that you started with, the two vignettes. What, if anything, do they teach us about race, racialization, and exclusion? What should we take away from those two stories?
I invite you to also maybe add or subtract from my reflection on those two vignettes. I offered these two vignettes as a way to help reflect about the academy as a space that functions through the expression of symbolic and material boundaries. Patterns of operation in the academy can be invisible, which and the forms of boundaries also take place at the subjective or at the cultural level. Invisible boundaries in the university reflect the meanings that academic spaces acquire through local knowledge or through cultural attributions. And what do I mean by cultural acknowledgements or attributions in the academy? In both the venues that I offered, we have objectified the spatial boundaries, and we come into the space with acquired knowledge that is reinforced in a particular way. Certain people are recognized because of who they are. And this is what I mean by cultural attribution. And for others to be recognized requires a particular knowledge that draws from outside the hegemonic culture of the academy. It draws from identity politics of the margins, the very same identity in that second venue that the university was trying to address. And this is what I learned from Annette Henry, that in actual fact, to disrupt the hegemonic culture of the academic, you need to be able to draw or to learn from the identity politics of the margins. The university has always been seen as an excellent laboratory for examining how these two patterns of symbolic and social boundaries intersect. And since the university is a site for intense territoriality and dramatic relations of inequality existing side by side, the university makes visible the boundaries and categories that exist within society at a structural level, and using the terminology of Lamont and Molnar at the symbolic level. So what goes on in the university really is what exists within society at the structural level. And we need to be able to work with that, to confront and disrupt that. And young people are actually doing that on a daily basis. Just we don't recognize their actions at the university because we see them as coming into the space where we can fill them, with knowledge. But their actions and their knowledge is already there somehow. Yeah.
Interesting. So then, a logical question would be, what can the university do?
I think universities are already doing something nowadays, and I mean it in a serious way. There has been, and I will keep returning to my colleague here, Warren Krishlow, the university has begun again. Things are happening at the university. And could you pull up, this is the part of my talk that's more organized than the first part, in the sense of I actually did think about what to suggest with regards to what the university can do. Last year, I was the chair of the York University's Faculty of Education's ad hoc committee on anti-Black racism. And some of what we did with my colleagues in that committee is what I will actually speak to or speak about today, not as a template, but as one of those things that others can learn from. And we are also at York University are happy to learn from other initiatives that are happening across the country, and there's quite a number of them. I wonder whether these are going to be successfully maintained, and if there are going to be resources going the direction of all of this that has been suggested. First, there needs to be acknowledgement. The university needs to be in a state of acknowledging and willingness to acknowledge the event, that it is affected and implicated in the work, in the events that have been happening around anti-Black racism and the discovery of indigenous people in residential places, because the university is a place of learning. And it is in the name of education that these bodies in residential schools, for example, were found. It is in the name of identity and education that there is this public lynching, killing of Black people. And the university, as a place of change, it needs to recognize and acknowledge its own responsibilities that are within the university. The second thing, I'm not sure that I would say creating awareness is one of the responsibilities, because awareness on its own doesn't mean anything if it is not necessarily followed by action. Awareness of what, right? But there is also a need to unlearn deep-seated biases and preconceived notions and ideologies at the university. I spoke briefly about my own experiences at in anthropology at U of T. So to unlearn preconceived notions is really something that is part of what the university needs to do nowadays. Preconceived notions about who people are, who the other is. The formation of the West, as Edward Said said, was really based on looking at what we call the Oriental or the other, right? Those ideologies of looking at others in a way that promotes Western hegemony is what we need to unlearn within the university. That's just one example of an ideology that I'm talking about. I talk about public commitments to anti-Black racism. Commitments, what might that look like? I think I'm going to talk about that when I'm talking about specific things that were recommended in my faculty. And policy change, anti-Black racist policies, what might that look like? Now, when you talk about behavioral changes, these are totally out of control of individual people. But the university is an institution that works with policies. Some behavior and practices must be supported by the university, but some behavior and practices must be confronted and disrupted through and by the university. And anti-Black racism is one of those. May I just scroll down? Oh, yeah, you will. Number one is fine. Go back one slide. Yeah, okay. In the committee that I worked with at York University, we spent hours and hours and hours trying to actually figure out what is it that our faculty can do to actually address issues of anti-Black racism, what it could do that was tangible beyond talk. And we came out with a list of what we called actionable items. And there were 5 of them, and they're also based on the principles of something that I will not discuss because it might take some time. We spoke, our first actionable item had something to do with resources. Now, you see, we can talk all we want. If there are no resources to support recommendations, it's just talk. It remains talk, and it doesn't mean anything. Well, talk does mean something in a way, but really. So we recommended that the faculty appoints an outreach person for student services, appoint an anti-Black racism coordinator is wrong here. It ended up being an anti-Black racism advisor to the dean on anti-Black racism. And Sarah Barat, who is the newly appointed, actually, advisor to the dean on anti-Black racism in the Faculty of Education. So some of these recommendations are actually already taking place. If you're an advisor to someone who has more power than you, we need to be thinking about the practicality and reality of that advising position also. It's just one of those things though, that the committee came out with. Realizing that the power relations need also to be taken into consideration, you know. With resources, we also recommended a database, training and support of faculty and staff, aesthetically diverse physical and virtual spaces of Faculty of Education. And the advisor, the role of the advisor as we mapped it out, it sounded like we were asking the faculty to appoint a superwoman, because the superwoman is going to be working in all of these fields. But we saw it as a start. So the second part that we recommended, which we thought the university could do, has to do with curriculum development. Well, this one is kind of like really interesting. Review curriculum and create anti-Black racism
There's no sound.
The speaker's mic seemed to be muted. No sound.
No sound?
Fine now, thank you.
It's fine? Okay. Okay, thanks. Okay. Pardon?
I don't know what they missed. I don't know what they missed when you.
Okay, all right. So when I was talking, I said I'm looking forward to actually talking with everybody and learning what is happening at the University of Windsor, having shared what we're doing, at York.
Yeah, and the third, the thing that you missed from your list was admissions and scholarships for pre-service and graduate students.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Well, the distribution, I think, yes, thank you. It's admissions and scholarships in pre-service and graduate studies. We wanted to look at inclusion of the, sorry, not inclusion. We wanted to look at how the admissions and scholarship committee in our faculty includes anti-Black racist orientation in its mandate, such that when you are looking at whom to give or whom to admit into the university, you consider other groups too. And you look at them not in a deficit model way, but in a way that says what resources do we need to put in place in order to support students who are coming from from different groups that have been traditionally marginalized. So that's what we are doing in the faculty. And we kind of keep, every time the committee does admissions, we revisit the mandate and how best to meet the mandate of each of these committees, which I will not get into, however. So I look forward to learning with you and from you what the University of Windsor is doing to move us forward, to move us forward to the next 2 years or 5 years following the pandemic and all of these other activities, political activities. I think I'll take comments and questions. And thank you, Cara and Clinton, for being here and organizing this.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're going to have a general Q&A session now.
Yeah.
And give our colleagues an opportunity to ask some questions, perhaps make some comments and observations, and just have a conversation with Nombuso. So the floor is open. We have any questions, any observations at all?
Who is monitoring the are you monitoring the chat box?
Trying to have a look.
Syed?
Syed, go ahead, Syed, we're hearing you.
Oops.
A
I think we
question
lost
from-
him.
A question from Dr. Sefton. How does gender intersect with who is visible? Or how has it in your own life? Have you found gender as well matters in your history as a growing academic?
Dr. Sefton, Terry, it's good to see you. Thank you for joining, Terry. I wonder if that's a trick question, but I want you to help me answer it also. I also want to invite you to reflect on your own trajectories as people who have been the people who have actually made a difference in your lives. And in thinking about those people, did gender matter? I think it does. Annette Henry has taught me that it does matter a lot amongst other people. But it's also interesting for me that if I look back at my own pathways, the people who make the most impact in my life are women, or who have made impact in my life are women impact in both ways, impact in empowering ways, and facilitating and giving me the opportunity to become, if I were to use that phraseology. But I think, for example, in growing up at high school, I was always very, very naughty, and I always went to the principal's office because I was playful. I got bored very easy, and I occupied myself and those around me as a high school student. And I was always sent to the principal's office. Until one day, I remember this woman teacher. She was explaining something on the blackboard. It had something to do with pi, the mathematical pi. So she started explaining it this way. And then she started explaining it the second way. By the third way, I was getting so bored. 22/7, in case people are wondering what I'm talking about. So seeing me trying now to start occupying myself, she said, Nombuso, you are bored. Open to page such and such and start doing question such and such in the book. So I started to work. But looking back, from that day on, I was never sent to the principal's office. What she did was she went back to the staff room during the subject discussion of the teachers, and she spoke about how perhaps they needed to approach my learning in a different way and facilitate my disruption instead of sending me to the principal's office, perhaps give me something to do. And I started noticing all other teachers doing the same thing. Now I know now today that's called critical pedagogy. I didn't know at that time. And it was only later when I went back to her and I asked her of the questions of what did you do that made me stop going to the principal's office. And she explained it that but that was a woman. So gender, I think, does matter to me. It does, I think it's a tricky question, Terry. But also when I think about the people who have had a devastating or perhaps a negative impact, things that are done with me or to me that have made me feel a little bit very small, have also been performed by women. Not that men don't do that, but they make more impact to me when women do engage in it, right? Because perhaps I expect more of a sisterhood community from that particular group of people. Terry, what would you say? Is she still here? I don't see her on that. What would you say in answering your own question? How would you conceptualize gender, and how would you see it in your life, in your own trajectory as a scholar and becoming a scholar?
Well, thank you for flipping the question. And you transitioned that question to people of influence, and I would agree. The people who most profoundly influenced me as I was moving through my path into academia, I would say almost all of them. Well, I think of Roger Simon. I can't ignore the influence. He had a huge impact on me at U of T and his scholarship. But yes, women were very impactful. But you've been talking today about what can a university do, that practical piece. And I know from sitting on Senate, for example, and from just observing our university over the past many years, who are the people who are still sitting in those positions of power? And you talked about the assistants, and who are the assistants? And so whether we're talking about race or we're talking about gender, the people who are still in that top echelon are mostly men, and many of the assistants echelon are mostly women. Yes, it's changing, but not very quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. I agree. I agree. Thank you for that comment. I think the university is very savvy in regenerating itself and its structures, and we need to disrupt that. I think that's what you're saying, really, that there needs to be that disruption of this recycling of itself. You know, we make distinguished scholars, and look again, who gets distinguished? It's a recycling of the same people. Yeah, I agree. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, there is a question from MPS here about number 3 on slide 3 of 4, not the item. So perhaps admissions and scholarships. MPS, would you like to unmute and describe?
Yes, and thank you very much for the opportunity to see how York has been moving forward. And my question has to do with taking a look at those items on the slide deck that came before item 4 and the wrap up on your slide deck, and the pace of change, I guess, is what I'm concerned about. I agree wholeheartedly with Terry that I think it is slide 15.
15, okay. This one.
That there's been such a glacial pace of change.
Admission, scholarship.
Yeah, it's hard to see the benefit of changing admission policies when we're bringing people into a toxic environment, both faculty and students. And it may be that slide 16 speaks to that, but I've really started questioning recently where my responsibility lies in terms of serving the public interest. And it's because I see the students who come in as very, very precious. They're other people's children. They can't be replaced. And the experiences that they are going to have at the university coming in, the experiences that of faculty coming in aren't changing. And I almost feel like all of our publicity around recruitment of any kind should carry a warning. But at the same time, you can't stop trying.
MPS, I totally agree with everything that you just said, and you're bringing us again to an important topic of how does change happen and who is responsible for change. I think we're all responsible for change, and we are responsible to disrupt the patterns of, for example, the patterns of experiences that students are recruited into and faculty into the academy. I do believe that, yes, the pace of change is another thing too. I keep returning to this notion of beginning again. When things become normal, as Gramsci, Althusser actually talks about when things stop to be ideas, when they're normalized, we stop to critique them. They just become those things that we do and work with on a daily basis. And so the patterns of admissions, the experiences that people have, when it's normal to have, oh, we know there are going to be Black kids in the classroom, they're all going to complain about racism. It's a normality, you know what? Get used to it. We know there is going to be, indigenous people in the classroom who are going to be feeling that they're not acknowledged, but that's just part of the classroom. So when things become so normalized in their problem state, then the university is failing the people that it's supposed to serve. So I do agree with you totally that the pace needs to change, and that we need to be held accountable as learners and professors to seeing others and disrupting the way of looking at ourselves and others and pretending that business is going well as usual, because it is not. So I agree with you. I agree with your comment. I agree with your sentiments of the torment of what do I do, because I know this is going to be the outcome. How do I change it? But the small change that you do, small changes accumulate to bigger changes. Yeah, that would be nice.
Thanks, Marie. Do we have any other questions?
I think you cut off our side.
Sayed,
Yeah.
no, I don't know if we've got a question.
Oh, okay.
I think he might have had a question. He was having problems with his microphone.
Okay.
Syed, did you still want to ask your question?
There's one here from Michael Adabe.
Let's go to Michael's question.
Michael asks, are there any strategies or insight you can provide in regard to encountering resistance to addressing ABR in the university, particularly from those from positions of power? That's a question, isn't it?
Strategies? Clinton, do you have any strategies for an insight you can provide in regards to encountering resistance to addressing ABR in the university? I think that's a very good question that is requires a thinking together in a way, because resistance is always going to be there in a sense, or resistance can be passive also, or active. And it's usually passive resistance where people do not say anything that they're saying no to, but they're also passively not doing anything, right? So I think that's what you're talking. It's a very good question, Michael.
Yeah, Michael, I would say it's going to be an issue. It has always been an issue. And I think the folks who experience racism, racial discrimination, and oppression in general on university campuses, faculty, staff, students, and there's a tendency to act as if we are powerless, to do something about it. So there's always, whenever we have these discussions about what are we going to do, it's always framed in the context of what's the administration doing, or what is the university? And I'm using air quotes. What's the university doing? What's the administration doing? And the university, is not seen to be a community of people who must come together and act in solidarity to solve these issues. So I would suggest, Michael, that you can't depend on university administrations to solve these problems. they obviously have to be a really, really big part of it. But I've been talking to students a lot over the last couple of months, and I have been saying to them, you actually have more power than you think you do, because universities respond to students. They must, because they cannot exist without students. And I think that, you know, university communities, people, and especially students, have to take a stance about the learning and working environment that is created on their campus. So I think we have to hold university administrations and leaders to hold their feet to the fire, and to push for change, and for them to go beyond words, you know, to have action that's going to be, you know, transformative.
Yeah, that's a very good. Thank you, Clinton. I actually also want to add this to that question, Michael, that there are very many acts of disrupting from bigger. We have small acts and we have bigger acts. I'll give you an example of one thing that I've seen happening in the university. See, as professors, we are very known to not wanting to be rude in the Canadian sense to the other person. So we're always polite. There is a responsibility that we've been given to acknowledge the land when we talk, when we start any of the university business. Now, I do want to acknowledge the fact that when you have been in meetings the whole day, sometimes you feel like I've been doing this over and over, all right? But for me, it's always important, even if I don't say the whole acknowledgement, it's always important to start by saying that I've already acknowledged the land, and so I am going to continue doing that, and I invite others to do the same. Now, I've seen this in my university where there are top people whenever I'm going to their meetings, they sit down, they say, what do we have today in the agenda? And they start talking, right? Small acts of disruption. Whenever there is Nombuso, okay, she's going to insist that this happens. We may as well do it, all right? And because there is a history, there is a meaning behind acknowledging the land. And even if you do not know the history, make it your responsibility to go learn it. And every time when you ignore it as an administrator and people around you think this is normal, there's something wrong there. So it's important to start with just the small act of the everyday before we go to the big policies that we're saying must be put into practice. So that's just an example that I'm using. And thank you, somebody is putting in some of the work that I've done, which has come out. Check out the edited volume. That's just come out today. And check out the specialized injustice in the contemporary city. It's coming out next year, 2022 in April.
Okay, thank you, Nombuso. Thanks for that question, Michael. Do we have
I think we have time.
One
we
more
have time
question?
for one more question.
Okay.
Francisca. The present ABR conversations are bound to have ripple effect in systems where racism and ABR have been silenced, and it is bound to create resistance from individuals and groups that have enjoyed privileged positions and supremacy over others. I guess talking more about ABR, not being silenced, will most likely get people to rethink and embrace inclusiveness and social belonging for all. And Michael Adebo thank you for your answers. As a student myself, it's great to hear that we have power as well.
Professor Francisco, and thank you, Michael.
Yes,
I'll probably turn it back over to Dr.
To
Smith
Kara.
to wrap up. Before you do that, can I make a really quick plug?
Yes.
On December 10th, we're having the first speaker in our Distinguished Speaker Series. Professor George Sepade will be coming to us on December 10th. So please register to participate in that really, really important discussion.
I have to thank everyone for showing up on a Friday morning, for hearing me speak. I want to acknowledge that there are initiatives that have started again in many universities. I have to also say that these are just a little drop. There is a lot of work to be done, and it's very important that we each reflect and look at the many ways that we see others and whether or not we recognize ourselves in the way in which we're looking at others. And it's important to also move towards action. And that's really my final thinking. And I encourage you to check some of the work that's been listed there on the chart book for strategies and for general learning about students, youth, and politics in the academy. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Nombuso. Professor Nombuso Dlamini, everyone from York University, and may I encourage a round of applause for her very generous and insightful, rich discussion this Friday morning, November 26th at the Faculty of Education. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good job, Nombuso.
Thank you, everybody. Oh.